Good evening. This is Keith Much on United FM Radio and WFPN Norwich, Connecticut. We're cross posting to other pages as well, the Connecticut State and New London County No Rules. Good evening, everybody. It is 5 o'clock here on the East Coast, and with me I have Roy E. Bork, the author and writer of the book The Merging of Two Worlds, and he has another book coming out very shortly. And this is his usual Thursday evening show where we talk about the misconceptions of religion. And Roy, how you doing?
I'm doing good tonight, Keith.
And what do you have for us today?
Tonight I want to talk about the Mayan calendar, but I want to start tonight's talk with evolution. They say that life evolved. We know this is true. We use the process in livestock and agricultural farming. We also have mapped out the genome, and we know that changes to DNA produce changes in the organism. So we know that evolution works. They say that evolution is a series of random mutations. Now they know that drugs and radiation can cause birth defects. So my question is, if the changes to DNA are all purely random, why should it matter what causes them? And I want you to think about that as I talk about today's subject, which is the Mayan calendar. I was first introduced to the Mayan calendar in 2005 by a coworker. I watched 2 DVDs by Ian Lungold, which was a Mayan teacher, and he had talked about 2 books that was books that were written by Carl Kalaman. Dr. Kalaman was a doctor that studied pandemics. And it was because of the demise of the Mayans that led him to research what happened to the Mayans. And while he was there, he went into a study of the Mayan calendar. It was quite an interesting book, so I ended up buying it. And what I'm going to talk tonight comes from 2 books. One of them, they're both by Carl Johan Kalaman, The Mayan Calendar and the Transformation of Consciousness, and Solving the Greatest Mystery of Our Time, the Mayan Calendar. Ian Lungold has passed away, but there is a website with a lot of his information. It's MayanMagics.com, MayanMagix.com. So if you're interested in anything I tell you tonight, that is a website that you can look up. Just in case anybody's interested in the book that I wrote about, the Mayan calendar is one of the chapters in the book. It's called The Merging of Two Worlds. I have a website called ScienceAndReligionConverging.com, which attempts to explain some of the misconceptions that prevent us from reconciling science with religion. So moving on. The Mayan calendar is based on a 360-day cycle called a Tun. It's T-U-N is how it's spelled. Some believe that the Mayans didn't know how long the solar year was. Well, it turns out that the Mayans had an agricultural calendar called the Hab, and it added 5 days to the Tun. An interesting point is that the Egyptians had the same 360-day calendar, and they had 5 unofficial days added to it in which the gods were born, and the gods of the Egyptians were part of an agricultural myth. The significance of the 360-day cycle becomes apparent when one looks at evolutionary changes. Because what they noticed is that 360 seems to work out a pattern that the solar year of 365 doesn't. The Mayan calendar, if you want to put up that picture, that'd be good. The Mayan calendar is made up of 9 levels. Each level represents a time span. And the time span...
You talking about the calendar graphics? Oh, okay, my bad.
No, what you have is fine right there. What you're seeing here is the Mayan temple at Chichen Itza in Mexico. And this is made up of 9 levels. And each level represents a time span. And the first level starts at the beginning, and the last level is the end of the calendar. Now each level is exactly 20 times longer than the one that follows. So when you map it out, the first level is 360 times 20 to the 7th power. And if you do the math, it comes out to 614 billion years. Now this is roughly the time of the Big Bang. Roughly they're saying that the Big Bang is somewhere around 13, 14 billion years ago. The Mayan calendar was saying 16.4. Of course, this calendar dates back to over 2,000 years ago. Now, the date that we're familiar with is the day December 21st, 2012, and there was a big deal about the Mayan calendar ends on December 21st, 2012. And what I'm going to do is go through why that date was so much of an issue. We're going to go back to the first level, 16.4 billion years. Each level is divided into 13 segments. And those 13 segments represent a process of development. It's basically 7 days and 6 nights. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with that because that's the days of creation in Genesis. Now, why cultures that were separated on opposite sides of the globe with seemingly no communication between them would have similarities between them is an interesting concept. Anyways, 13 segments go as such. The first day is sowing. The first night is the inner assimilation of new wave. The second day is germination. The second night is resistance against new wave. The third day is sprouting. The third night is assimilation of new wave. The fourth day is proliferation. The fourth night is expansion of new wave. The fifth day is budding or flowering, which would be, budding. I'm getting ahead of myself here. The fifth night is destruction. The sixth day is flowering. The sixth night is fine-tuning of new protoform. And the seventh day is fruition. So if you imagine these 13 levels as the growth of a plant, that's basically what these 7 days and 6 nights represent. the growth of a plant. So, if you were to take, now each level, these 13 segments are equally spaced levels. They're not mixed up with different time spans. You divide 16.4 by 13 and it gives you 1.26 billion years between each segment. Now, where does the second level come in? If you would divide the first level by 20, the second level begins at the beginning of the 20th segment. So it would be a portion of the last 13th segment of the level. So in this case, each segment of the first level is 1.26 billion years. The second level is 820 million years long, and it fits into that 13th segment of the first level. Now, this is the same for all 9 levels. So each level is superimposed into the 13th segment of the previous level. Now, what archaeology determined was that the start date of the 6th level was on August 11th, 3114 BC. The 6th level let's see.
1755?
That's when it started. I'm trying to think. It's each segment is 394 years. Somewhere I have when it begins. I mean, that's when it begins, but how long the whole level is. I know it's longer than 3114 years because it includes the 2,000 years after Christ. So I'm missing that information right here, but we'll go along. When you calculate out the length of each segment, of course, you're dividing each one by 20. You add that to the August 11th, 3114 BC, and the end date comes to December 21st, 2012. Now, it's what happens in each one of these levels that caught Kalaman's attention, Dr. Kalaman, and has also grabbed my attention. In the last segment of the first level, you have cells, multicellular organisms develop on planet Earth, and it's called the cellular conscious level. When you follow the second level, it goes through the same growth period, and in the final segment, you have mammals dominate the land. So it's called the mammalian conscious level. The third level, again, it's got the 13 stages of growth, and in the final stage, you have family-oriented groups with the primates. So it's called the familial conscious level. The fourth level, same growth period. It ends in Homo sapiens and tribal groups, so it's called the tribal conscious level. In the fifth level, same 13 segments, same growth. It ends in the regional conscious level, Homo sapiens and agricultural groups. On the sixth level, it's called the national conscious level. And in this segment, all the world's nations and all the world's religions are formed. Not in the final segment, but during that level. The sixth level is also known as the Great Cycle, The seventh, and it's called the national conscious level. The seventh level, same growth period, it's called the planetary conscious level. It is globalization, and it ends in the internet, global communications. The eighth level is called the galactic conscious level. And the ninth level is called the universal or cosmic conscious level. So what you're seeing here in each growth period, you're seeing a jump in conscious awareness. First one is cells, second one is mammals, third one is primates, fourth one is hominids, fifth one is Homo sapiens, sixth one is nations and religions, seventh one is globalization, the eighth one you have the internet, the International Space Station and the SETI program, and the ninth one is conscious co-creation. And the interesting thing is, because all of these levels are superimposed on each other, they all ended on the same day. All 9 levels ended on December 21st, 2012. And because these various levels seem so correlated with the evolutionary process, everybody said, oh my God, what's going to happen? The calendar is coming to an end. Now somebody said, well, they just stopped counting. Well, when you realize that they're all superimposed on each other and they all end on the same day, no, they didn't stop counting. This is an end date. And it's an end date with a meaning. Now, because of the various prophecies, there was a movie came out, it was called 2012. And it appears to be based on a book called Pole Shift, The Ultimate Natural Disaster. Now, I read this book before I saw the movie, so that's why I could make the correlation. The book predicted a magnetic field reversal which would result in movement of the Earth's surface. And this was supposed to be a global catastrophe. And the evidence to support this theory was, it appeared that there was a whole herd of woolly mammoths frozen in the permafrost in Siberia. They had an experiment using liquid mercury with an object floating on the mercury, and as long as there was a magnetic field, the object floating appeared to have an adherence, so it kept it firm. And as soon as the magnetic field was taken away, the object that was floating was free to float about whatever. So the concept was, if the Earth's magnetic field were to collapse, that the Earth's surface, which is floating on a liquid mantle, may be able to do the same thing. And because there was large buildups of ice at the poles, that it would imbalance the Earth, and as soon as the Earth was no longer adhered to the core, that the surface was free to just move around. And that's what the movie 2012 was predicting. So the way to survive it was to have these huge arcs. Anyways, there was another one, Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet, in which his prophecies, or not prophecies, but all of his information is recorded at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, Virginia Beach. He had some prophecies about what was supposed to happen during the 1990s. And there was also global evidence that the previous ice ages do not conform to the current geological position. It was known that at one time a ice sheet covered a lot of North America. And Keith and I even went to a place called Glacial Park in Ledyard, which was a glacial rift, and this was actually where the edge of the glacier was melting. So the glacier actually came this far north. But when they looked on the opposite side of the globe, they didn't find the same evidence of ice sheets covering the Earth. So it was an appearance that somehow the whole Earth's surface may have shifted. So this was what the book was based on, all these evidences. Now the book that I bought was a later update. It was called 10-Year Update. And so this guy, after he published the book, began to look at all his prophecies, began to look at all his evidences, and he began to discover flaws. And from these flaws, he wrote an update, and I read the update, and the author goes through and he debunks each piece of evidence that he presented in the book, and by the time he's done with the update, he says, never mind. But what it worked out is this. The woolly mammoths were not part of a continuous herd. By using carbon dating, they actually discovered that these woolly mammoths were thousands and 10,000s of years apart from each other. So they didn't all get caught in this global freezing all at once. The other thing he discovered is that it is known that the Earth's magnetic field shifts. And they say that on the average it shifts about 1 every 100,000 years. And the last shift is known to have occurred about 300,000 years ago. So we're overdue. And the way they determine this is by movement of the ocean floor. We know that they have tectonic plates. So there's places in the ocean floor in which magma is coming up and it's pushing the plates apart. And as it pushes the plates apart, it's creating also a record. Because as this magma solidifies, it actually records the magnetic field's strength and direction. And so by taking core samples of the ocean floor, they can actually determine what the Earth's magnetic field was eons ago. And so that's how they came up on an average of about 100,000 years, and that the last one was about 300,000 years ago. And that's also in the ice sheets at the poles, is that somehow the data is somehow caught in the ice sheets, that they can also cross-reference these ideas. But what he also discovered is that when the Earth's magnetic field changes, it doesn't collapse. It may weaken. It doesn't shift all at once. The shift may take anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 years to occur, so it's not an overnight thing. It doesn't collapse completely. There's a weakening process. It moves and then it re-strengthens itself, and they don't exactly know exactly why, but they know that that's the cause. It has to do with the iron core at the center of the Earth. So the idea that the magnetic field would collapse and that the Earth was free to move on the mantle will no longer applied. He also realized that ocean currents would bring warm water into areas on the opposite side of the globe from the North American continent, which would offset the global ice sheet formation. So the idea that North America was covered by glacier and that the glaciers don't appear to be of the same latitude worldwide, well, the ocean currents and the warming of the oceans counted for that. So one by one, he basically debunked all of his evidence until... So now the question is, did the end date of the Mayan calendar really signify anything? And what I discovered is that when you read Eastern philosophy, it brings up an interesting point. It talks about evolution and it talks about involution, which is part of the life cycles of the cosmos. Life is evolving. But evolving means unfolding. Unfolding from what? Something that was previously folded up. After the Mayan calendar, it appears that the process is reversing itself. According to the Eastern philosophy, spirit has been descending into matter, and it's becoming dense matter and very materialistic. And that's what we're seeing in our world today as compared to ancient cultures. But at some point, the process would reverse itself, and matter would begin to ascend back into spirit. And this is basically the folding up process, making the preparations for when the next cycle repeats itself. So using that as an analogy, the end of the Mayan calendar is the halfway point. Now that's one possibility. The other possibility is that we are doing something now that we have never done in the history of the earth. And that is, this is the first time period since the earth's formation that we are actually able to leave the planet. We have the International Space Station. We've journeyed to the moon. We've spent space probes out to the planets. And now they're talking about a space mission to Mars. NASA is trying to come up with ideas of interplanetary travel, and they're even talking about possibilities of interspace travel. Right now it's all theory. But the fact is, this was never talked about until the last century. The fact that the Mayan calendar was developed over 2,000 years ago seems to predict the events that are taking place, says they knew something. But the other thing is, why does the evolutionary changes fit into the segments so well? Is evolution as much haphazard as the scientists tell us it is? Now I'm presenting that as a theory. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I'm saying that this may be an alternate. That maybe life doesn't evolve haphazardly. It seems to be following a schedule. Everything seems to have happened on cue. And it's just something for further study, something to think about. So, Mayan calendar. When I found this, I was quite intrigued by the whole concept. Another thing that we're seeing recently, since the end of the Mayan calendar, is you take a look at TV programs. Ancient aliens. You're seeing a lot of talk about UFOs, about ancient aliens, extraterrestrials, people that visited here. That wasn't talked about centuries ago. Another thing you're seeing is ghost hunters. Another thing you're seeing is venturing into the paranormal. People are looking for anomalies into our understanding of space and time. Of course, we now have in the last century string theory. And string theory says that there may be as many as 11 dimensions. Well, how many are we aware of? And how much is there left for us to learn? My belief is that the end of the Mayan calendar is what we call a paradigm shift. And so it means that there's a change taking place. Now, when I was a young boy, my brother came up to me and he was concerned. He said, I believe I had a premonition of my own death. And I said, why is that? He says, I was crossing the road, and he says, I passed a certain point, and he says, all of a sudden I heard this message. It was almost like somebody was talking to me. And it said, in 4 years, the life you know will be taken. And he says it concerned me for a bit. And then he said, a year to the day, I was crossing the road, and at that very same point, the very same thing happened, except this time it was, in 3 years, the life you know will be taken. And he says, that kind of startled me. He said, I don't know if it means that my life's going to come to an end, but he says, that's what it appears to be. And so he said, if anything happens to me in 3 years, I want you to know that it was meant to be. It was God's will, because we were a religious family. It was God's will. Even if you're involved, I don't want you to feel any responsibility. There's nothing you could have done. It was meant to be. He says, all right. Put it aside. What will be, will be. Well, 3, 2, 1, 0 years, and my brother's still around, and I remember him sitting at the table, and we were blowing out the birthday candles, and he had this strange look on his face. And at first I didn't understand what that look was until he talked to me later. He says, I can't understand while I'm still here. He says that feeling was so strong. He says, I shouldn't be here. So one day he decided to meditate on the issue, and he said, okay, what went on? And he had a revelation. It was like an epiphany. He realized that it wasn't his life, his physical life, that ended. He had changed. He had gone from a boy to a young adult. And there's a saying in Eastern philosophy, when the man appears, the child is no longer. And he realized that that's what his premonition was. It wasn't about his life was coming to an end. He was going through a transition. And so when I hear religion talk about the end of the world, I think about my brother's story, I think about the end of the Mayan calendar, and I say, is it possible that the end of the world is not what religion wants us to believe it is? A cataclysmic end, destruction, massive death. Is it possible that it means a transition? We are certainly going through a transition right now with our development of the space program. This wasn't possible 100 years ago. It certainly wasn't possible 2,000 years ago. So when Jesus talks about the end of the world, a lot of it is symbolism. I have to remember that he always spoke in parables and that things weren't always what they appeared to be. Now, he had the parable of the prodigal son, and it was a father who had 2 sons, and one of them, his youngest son, decided he wanted to go off on his own. So he went to his father and he says, Father, give me my inheritance. And so the father gives him his inheritance, and the young boy goes off and he squanders it off on riotous living, and before long the money runs out. He didn't invest it. And now he's got no money, he's got no place, he found himself homeless. The only thing he could find to eat was the swill that they fed the pigs. And he said to himself, my father's servants have it better than I do. He says, I'm going to go back and I'm going to submit myself to my father, and I'm going to say, Father, I've sinned. I'm at your mercy. Make me one of your servants. And so the prodigal son goes back. And it's what the father says that caught my attention. When he saw the son coming, he says, here is my son who was dead and has come back to life. And I said, well, we know that the young son wasn't dead physically. So what did he mean by that? Here is my son who was dead. And I realized that this again is a shift. When the kid came to his senses and decided to submit himself to his father, it was a similarity to what religion all along has been saying, that we need to submit ourselves to the Father in heaven. Of course, they never really understood who the Father in heaven was. And what I discovered is that when Galileo challenged the church, claiming that the earth wasn't the center of the universe and that he had proof that there were moons orbiting Jupiter, which would go against the theory, the church issued a decree that no scientific hypothesis could be presented that would in any way challenge the scriptures. They also separated God from reality. Now, I discovered that the definition of theology, I know I have that definition somewhere. You give me a moment, I got to find it. I have two dictionaries. One of them is 1904, and the other one is printed in I think it was 52. And I looked up the word theology, and there were two different definitions. The one recently, I'm just going to try to paraphrase it as best I can. The one recently says that theology is the study of Supreme Being and its relations to the cosmos and the study of church doctrine. That's the most recent one. When I read the first one, it said theology has two branches, natural and revealed. Natural theology is that which we can know of God by his works through the way of nature and reason. And revealed theology is that which we can know of God by direct revelation. Now, when I read the first one, natural theology, that which we can know of God by his works through nature and reason, well, that's the whole scientific method. We observe nature, and by reasoning, we come up with the laws of the cosmos. And I discovered that the law of God and the laws of the cosmos are the same thing. The ancient people saw it differently than we did because they were operating in different functions of the brain. But I'm not going to go into that right now. I just want to go to the fact that in the ancient world, science was part of theology. And in the modern world, it no longer is. The ancient world saw God and the forces of nature as synonymous, and the modern world sees God as something that is separate. And so that has become an issue, is we've separated God from reality. And reality is actually, God is the foundation upon which reality is built. So when we're studying science, in the ancient world, we're learning about God's laws. And that's what we call the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, the laws of electromagnetics that make up the physical world as we know it. And that's one of the issues of not being able to reconcile science with religion, because religion drove a wedge between the two. And we need to somehow remove that wedge and put them two together. And then some of this stuff can start to make sense. Now, I have no trouble believing that life evolved. I do have trouble believing that nothing's running the show. People will say things like, Well, the cosmos is a self-running system. It runs itself. And I say, okay, I'll go along with that. Tell me what itself is. And it kind of throws them for a loop because they really have to think of the question. So when I'm studying science, I'm studying the laws of God. Of course, that's one of the shifts that people go through. Eastern philosophy says you go through 3 stages. The first stage is you believe in God. The second stage is you either become an atheist or an agnostic. And then the third stage is you have to redefine what the word God means. And most people are either in the first or the second stage. So I've transitioned to the third stage, and that's what the merging of two worlds is all about. What did I learn? How did I learn it? The Mayan calendar is part of it. How ancient people thought is part of it. How definitions have changed recently in the last century is part of it. And it tries to bring the two back together. Keith, you got anything you want to add to this?
None at this time. I think you've summarized it all.
Okay, so it's the merging of two worlds. Science and Religion Converging.com is the website.
Which is linked down below.
So he'll tell you all about what's in the book. I actually write better than I talk. Each chapter is subdivided, so I don't get off to different subjects. When I first started writing the book, I felt like I was on a pogo stick, and that may be what you feel now because I kind of diverge from here to there. But the book tries to put it all in an organized sense. So if you're interested in knowing more about how religion and science are related, the name of the book, The Merging of Two Worlds. I looked it up today on the internet, and one of the comments was because somebody gave me a review on Amazon.com, and that shows up on the internet, so I was pretty pleased with that. But anyways, so that is the end of my talk tonight. I wish you well. God bless. Good night.